Okay. I assume that you can see this without difficulty. Okay, so here you have Cary Grant in North by Northwest playing Roger Thornhill. He says that he's protesting that he got tickets for the theater, but he looks to be in the theater already, which is the way his interlocutor takes him to be, playing a fictional character. I'll come back to this later. So this continuous conversation that I have been having with Stacy Friend on the nature of the fiction non-fiction divide. This is the most recent installment is in a change in studies on documentary films. We have these two papers there. I'm going to present my own, and I'll say something probably about hers. Okay, I'll try to be quick because I have a lot of material, but so you have the slides. I sent the slides to Elvira in case you want to come back to anything, it's written there. And I'll also send the paper in case somebody is interested. So following Greg, some writers defend speech act accounts of the fiction non-fiction distinction, which is extended by people like Noel Carroll, Bonek, Plantinga to the moving image media. On this view, in outline, fictions result from speech acts, proposals to imagine, again speaking in general, inviting a response of imagining or make-believe. And Stacy has been notoriously contesting these views. She says things like, there is no conception of imagining or make-believe that distinguishes a response specific to fiction as opposed to non-fiction. We should give up the quest for necessary and sufficient conditions for fictionality, because there are no essential features that distinguish between fiction and non-fiction. Her worries arise both for literary fictions and films. We had been discussing mostly literary fictions, but today I'll be discussing mostly films. I agree with the main reasons that she offers, but I think that they are well addressed to the view of speech acts, the specific view of speech acts that Greg was assuming, which is a Gricean descriptive account. And I think that if one invokes an alternative Austinian normative view, one can get off the hook of her criticisms and rebut these claims that she makes about whether imagination is essential to fiction or otherwise. So moving to these speech act views, Greg provided a Gricean analysis of fiction making as constituted by Gricean reflexive intentions to produce specific imaginings, on the basis of the recognition of the intentions to produce them. I like this sort of account in contrast with content accounts like Goodman's account, on which, I mean, that whether or not we have fictions depends on properties of the content, like truth, how many truths you are putting forward. If you have many truths, you have non-fiction. If you have many non-truths, you have fiction. So in contrast with this sort of view, I like the emphasis here on the type of illocutionary act, precisely because it allows us to put aside matters of content veridicality. So Ken Walton famously asks himself, could an author be claiming truth for every sentence he writes and still be writing fiction? And he says, I see no reason why not. I'm not going to read more than this. I have been giving examples illustrating this. I cannot go into the details, but in the evidence to support this, but in the in the paper that I sent, you have quotations from the preface from this novel by Natalia Ginzburg, Lessico Familiare, and also quotations from a discussion with Akhtar, the author of Homeland Elegies, that illustrate or for me establish that as far as the reader can tell, everything that these authors write in these novels could be true. And still they declare and they give very good reasons congenial to a normative account for contending that they are doing fiction and they should be taken as doing fictions. And in particular, they both insist, Natalia Ginzburg and Akhtar, they insist that they want to be subject to be beholden to norms for fiction and not to all norms for specific norms for non-fiction. But in spite of this, Greg argued that this fictive intent, or this, for instance, the intent of being beholden exclusively to norms specific to fiction making, he claims that this is not enough for fictionality. There is some truth condition that applies, also a necessary condition having to do with that the claim that the contents, they can be true, but they should be at most accidentally true. So they should not, the act of putting forward these contents cannot be counterfactually dependent on the facts. While in the examples that I just gave, I think that this is not the case. I think that probably these people, Ginzburg is putting forward most of the things that she's putting forward, or perhaps everything is true. And she would have been putting forward different things for us to imagine if the truth or what she believed to be the truth had been different. And also other people have different versions of this, as Stacy calls it a mere make-believe condition. Lamarck and Olsen, David Davis, Catherine Stock, I mean, confronted with the kind of objection that that Stacy makes, they have devised ways of weakening the condition that Greg originally had, but still all of them, even in the weakest form that, for instance, Catherine Stock provides, would reject the examples that I have given as examples of fictions. And to support this, all these authors sometimes provide intuition palms that, as you can imagine, I find uncompelling. And it's not just my case. I mean, some of them also agree that some of these examples are not very convincing, that they can be explained in different ways. I have a kind of psychoanalytical account, but it's not just psychoanalytical. Perhaps a concealed motivation lies in this, in the Gricean setting in which all these accounts are given. And the thing is that if you have a very weak understanding of the imagination, and in fact, I think that now, until now, I was not so convinced, but now I'm convinced that we should give relatively a very weak account of what the imagination in itself is. To me, imagining is just conceiving or entertaining a proposition, quite in general. So if one has one of these weak views of what imagining is, in asking one to believe P, one thereby asks the audience also to imagine the relevant content. But then, to distinguish non-fiction from fiction in this setting, we need something more than just this notion of inviting to imagine, because, for instance, like this truth condition, that in the case of fiction, the imaginings should not be meant also to be believed. Anyway, that is my speculation about, in some cases, Gibson, for instance, goes along with this kind of consideration. So as Stacy has been pointing out, this creates this patchwork problem, which I mean is something that Greg points out, that this has the consequence that most fictional works are, as he put it, a patchwork of fiction making an assertion. This can be illustrated with the case of contents that set the temporal or spatial locations of realist fictions, like historical fictions, biopics, or relevant background, like Anna Karenina's famous first sentence. Now, Greg takes away the importance of this question. He gives the example of water, saying that if we want to characterize the real essence, we want to provide a real definition of what it is enough if we define what pure water is, and of course then quantities that include water but some other things, then they are going to be difficult to classify, and they are going to create indeterminacies. But Stacy points out, and I think that she's right, that the case of fiction is not like this, because as in fact Greg accepts, in the first place, what matters to us, what affects our appraisals and guides our intuitions is the classification of works, not the classification of smaller utterances composing them. This is particularly so for artworks, and this is what I'm talking about today. I take it that documentaries could be artworks, or could be meant as artworks, and be artworks, and very good examples of them. So if we focus on artworks, their proper appreciation depends, as I think Stacy clearly shows, on their classification of fiction or non-fiction. Now, a further point about this, Greg, when he has this very influential account of documentaries that I will mention later, and there he points out that there is a sort of hermeneutic circle, so that we cannot define just what it is for an utterance, for instance, a shot in a film, to be a documentary or part of a documentary, because the very same shot could be part of a documentary. For instance, there is this documentary called Room 237 about peculiar interpretations of The Shining, and there you find shots of The Shining. So the very same shot could be part of a documentary and of a fiction. So as he points out, we need to define at the same time fictional utterance and fictional work. But I think that the same, or even more clearly, the same issue arises for fictions. We cannot make sense of what the contribution of an utterance to a fiction could be unless we have we account for that as part of a global account of what the fiction is, because otherwise the utterance could be unreliable, for instance. Then we have the, as Stacy has been pointing out, the contrasting problem that many non-fictions include invitations to imagining, like thought experiments in philosophy, etc. And they pose a similar, or reenactments in the case of documentaries. So this is what I'm going to illustrate now. These issues have been mentioned in literary case, but the same issues arise with films. For instance, Masha Gessen has an important criticism of HBO's fiction show Chernobyl. She says that the show is a lie because it includes fantasies, embellishments, shortcuts, which simply, she says, are not the truth. The criticism is, I take it, pertinent. although even I myself don't agree with it. But this is not the point. The point is that the criticism is prima facie well taken or worth considering. So this shows that fiction can be criticized as if it included assertions. There are many other examples. I mean, Stacy has been given many of them. We have the criticisms of the imitation game for being very untruthful to the real life of Alan Turing. And the other way around, we have praise of these movies, Leviathan, A Touch of Evil, in that they, as Ian Buruma puts it, they reveal the social and political landscapes of these countries more precisely than anything I have seen in print, and I'm sure that he has seen in print many non-fiction accounts of the political landscapes of those places. Or we have praise of Bohemian Rhapsody for its reconstruction of the Live Aid concert. The other side of the coin is documentaries that include reenactments, things that are presented explicitly as fiction, famously Errol Morris, That Thin Blue Line, Oppenheimer's The Act of Killing, that I will talk about later. I think that there are similar cases with fiction films. So I mentioned here these two. I mean, this film by a Spanish movie maker, My Mexican Pretzel. This is explicitly classified as fiction, but it's something like like Boyhood, except that I had imagined this as a thought experiment, but this is in fact what I have the way I thought that Linklater could have done Boyhood in a less complicated manner than he did. So this woman just made the movie using family footage, but she classifies that as fiction, and it's the same situation as with Ginsburg or Akbar. Sorry, I had this previous example of Dean's novel. So for all I can tell, everything in that film are traces contributing as such to the film's narrative. And this is Greg's definition of what a pure documentary would be. The same applies to this other film that Enrico Terrone pointed out to me, Adolescence. Very commendable, like the other one, by the way. This is classified as in the Internet Movie Database as a documentary, but I think that this is just because people are confused about these things. Critics have pointed out that it could be seen as fiction, and I think I agree with Enrico that it looks much more like a fiction of the kind that Ginsburg. Anyway, I mean, all these cases are going to be controversial. My only claim here is that I like to have for my own ideology, my own way of conceptualizing these things. I like to have an account of the fiction non-fiction divide that allows me to classify these things not as indeterminate cases, but as straightforward fictions. Which I think fits what, as I said, Ginsburg and Deans and Jimenez at least say about their films, about their works. So for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to present my alternative in outline, of course. I mean, the details are going to be complicated, but I hope to give you the flavor of the contrast between Gracian and Austinian theories of speech acts, and then the way I understand what Stacy is saying and my reasons to disagree with it, and my reasons to believe that an Austinian speech act account couldn't have the difficulties that I'm going to point out for Stacy's. So speech acts like assertions, they have this, everybody would agree that they have this psychological dimension. Typically, they are meant to produce belief on the basis of the recognition of this intention. At least in clear cases, this is uncontroversially the case. They also have normative, there are norms that apply to them. We praise or criticize them and on many different counts. Among them, in these ways that look more central, as informative or based on knowledge or truthful or the opposite. So the debate is which of these things are defining and which of these things provide the nature or essence, as I would say, of these objects, assertions. Now, famously, for the case not of what we could call assertion in general, so a generic speech act of assertion which could include many different things, weaker and stronger things, but for a very specific species of assertion, which he calls flat-out assertion. And he claims that this is what we do by default with declaratives, so unless we make clear contextually or explicitly that we are doing something else. If we utter a declarative, we would be taken as making one of these flat-out assertions. Williamson argues that this should be understood along the lines of in the way that games are typically understood, although there is a lot of controversy here about what this constitutive rules view means for the case of games. But the idea that Williamson explores is that, yeah, indeed, assertion is a language game and it should be understood as defined by constitutive rules, by a defining rule, in particular in this case by a really simple one, which is this knowledge rule. To put this in a less precise but perhaps or hopefully clearer way, the idea is that a flat-out assertion is an act with a content, P, whose essential nature lies in its being prohibited when the agent ignores P. Unlike what people say about constitutive rules, people like Searle and his followers, this means, and it's very important for this view to be taken seriously, as Williamson emphasizes, that the idea is that flat-out assertion is what Nicholas Wolterstorff calls a norm kind, and Julian Dodd, for instance, defends also this view for music. So these are kinds that are defined by norms, so that potentially they have both correct and incorrect instances. So you can be asserting when you put forward something that you ignore, that is false. You are still asserting, or you can be still asserting. It's simply that you are doing that wrongly, because this is a kind that is constitutively defined by a norm. So for my ontological aims, for my aim of making this explicit, what I take to be this debate with Stacy, which I take to be a debate about the ontology of this distinction, fiction of fiction. So these are the most significant features of these Austinian accounts. First, they assume, with Greg, for instance, Greg was assuming this about documentaries too, and with the folk, according to psychologists, and with philosophers like Birch or Kripke or Putnam, that there are real kinds whose nature explains the divisible features we use to pick them out. For water, I mean, this is controversial as everything, but for this mock example, the essence would be given by being H2O, and this is the essence, or this defines the real nature of water, because it explains, among other things, why quantities of liquid that fall under this that have this property of being H2O are also colorless, odorless, tasteless, whatever. This view can be extended to social constructs. There are social constructs that are also real kinds in that they have this somehow explanatory, hidden, sufficiently hidden definitions. And I take it that specific games are like this, specific institutions are like this, specific artworks are like this. So they have normative natures like flat out assertion, but more importantly, is the normative condition is not enough. We must have also an account of how this norm is enforced, which could be given, for instance, as Cristina Vicchieri suggests, by social norms. In many cases, for instance, in the case of games, the relevant norms are just conventions. Not all social norms are conventions, but in many cases they are. They are contingent conventions, and therefore the kinds in question have a historical character. Perhaps biological kinds are like that. Surely practices like analytic philosophy have, to the extent that they have real definitions, the definitions are going to appeal to something like a history. I will later outline a little bit more how this could be, because this has been very well studied for the case of biological species. But not all of them need be so, need have a historical character. And flat out assertion, for instance, is a plausible case in which intuitively, at least, it would be better for this not to be a historical kind. Because, I forgot to mention that, but Greg has a very nice paper about this too. So if being a tiger only has one of these relational, cladistic, for instance, evolutionary definition, and being an analytic philosopher definitely is only going to have one of these definitions. I mean, you are an analytic philosopher if you are properly connected to Frege and Russell. There are no intrinsic way of defining what an analytic philosopher is. If this is so, you are not going to find, in the strict sense defined by these rules, these conditions of being an analytic philosopher, you are not going to find analytic philosophers in Mars, not tigers, nor tigers, sorry. But when it comes to flat out assertion, it sounds weird that seems to be a so very basic speech act. I mean, something to share, to pool our information, that in principle, at least, I think it could be, it sounds like intuitively plausible that any rational beings that may be out there should have something like a similar institution. Anyway, so in previous work, I have defended to apply this Austinian model to the fiction-non-fiction divide. The resulting view is, in fact, closer to Walton's if one puts aside his reservations about the speech accounts. This is in the very the roughest outline, the idea. We can partially order imaginative projects given the interest of people enjoying them in a scale on how worthwhile they are. Some imaginative projects that, for instance, that fiction proposes are things that we enjoy very much, while others, for instance, the imaginative project afforded by the phone book is a non-starter. I give you my examples of those that would be at a nice extreme of the scale. And then I assume what semanticists say for the semantics of gradable adjectives like being short, being tall, and I propose this norm. The rule for fiction is that if one proposes something at fiction, one becomes beholden to the norm, that what the imaginative project that one is advancing should be worthwhile, interesting enough for the intended audience. To put it again in this, forgetting about the details, fictionalizing is again a norm kind, so there are good and bad instances of this. And the idea is that this is an act with content P, whose essential nature lies in its being disallowed when the fiction maker proposes an imaginative project about this content below this threshold, this contextual threshold. I hope this is clear enough. So let me say why this conception. I mean, of course, I mean, no account of the fiction non-fiction divide is going to prevent indeterminacies. I think that biologists provide very good definitions of the male-female divide, but any such divide is going to have indeterminate cases. And obviously the same applies here. Parsley Livingston once mentioned to me this film by von Trier called The Five Obstructions, and I really don't know what to do with that. There is a recent biopic about Bertolt Brecht called Brecht. I don't know how to classify that. So the idea is not to have the idea is to have an account. What we should have is an account that doesn't leave unaccounted for things that, for instance, what I take to be a clear-cut case of fiction, like the Ginsburg novel or the fiction film My Mexican Pretzel that I mentioned before. This is the goal. So how is it that this has, or so I think, the promise of not falling short on account of the patchwork problem? First, as in Greg's account of documentaries, speech act norms apply to whole discourses. So we can, of course, we should go back and forth considering the contribution that fictional utterances make to the fictional work, but the two things should be defined together. We don't need to impose mere make-believe conditions. This is because a primarily assertoric work, a non-fiction, might nonetheless be structurally subserved by acts not subject to assertoric norms, as happens. So I think it's there is no doubt that a philosophy paper like Seal's paper with that Chinese room thought experiments, that is subject to assertoric norms, by the way, not to the norm for flat out assertions at all, but is subject to a weaker assertoric norms. But and it includes an invitation to imagine, and perhaps one that fulfills norms for such acts, like the one that I mentioned. But it's clear that the fiction part of the paper is subordinate to the other. So to the extent that this is so, we could have something that is as a whole non-fiction, even though it has a part that is fiction. In fact, one and the same act might be subject to different norms. That again happens typically with speech acts. I say, I will never drink again, and I am both asserting and promising. The asserting is tactic, as Michael Dummett put it. The promise is strategic, is I'm doing one by doing the other. This is so the same applies to fiction making. The fiction maker might be strategically committed to the norm for fictions, but tactically committed also to norms for assertion, for assertoric norms, not necessarily those for flat out assertion. for instance, in the interest of realism. As I point out here, even if in this way the assertions are somehow indirect, you have to, in fact, I have argued in one of these papers that Alberto was mentioning that the assertions that you can find in fictions in this way are indirect and could be accounted for with a general account of indirect speech acts. But even if this is so, still they might essentially contribute to the fulfillment of the constitutive norm for the fiction, because they thereby make the imaginative project more valuable than it would otherwise be. So I'll go back now to North by Northwest and the act of killing as an illustration of what I was saying. So I mentioned at the beginning this film North by Northwest by Hitchcock. George Wilson, in his wonderful book on narration, the first one, 1986, he has an account of this film that I find very plausible, in which it's a kind of, Hitchcock is making a kind of metafictional claim, a philosophical claim about fictions. He's making the point that against people that were criticizing him for providing mere entertainment, he's making the point that, well, our ordinary life is full of fictions, like this spy that the CIA has created, George Kaplan, and Roger Thornhill comes to play this role, and fictions could be excellent. For instance, this guy comes to be, by some counts, a better human being after playing this role than it was at the beginning of the film. That is one of the lessons that Wilson suggests we can take from, of course, I mean, the same point, but in the opposite direction, obtains with Rear Window or with Vertigo. We also may interpret this documentary that I mentioned, The Act of Killing, along very similar lines, making a very similar point, although things here are complicated. I refer to a nice paper on this, but the idea would be that we can see the act of killing as making the point that by being led to reenact his atrocities, to do this sort of reality-directed fiction, because it's a fiction. I mean, it's a kind of drama that he is forced to or asked to do, reenacting his atrocities. But by doing that, he comes to experience disgust towards them and perhaps also become a better person. So in both cases, we would have, if these points are points made by these films, they would be indirect assertoric acts, but nonetheless, I think by deploying this Austinian ideology, we have the conceptual resources to say that still the two films are different, because North by Northwest in itself is just subject to the fiction norm, while the act of killing is subject to some kind of assertoric norm. This would be a reason for that. I'm emphasizing, I mean, I have given Williamson's assertoric norm, which is an assertoric norm. I insisted about that for a species kind of act. There is a problem in all that I'm saying. Perhaps we can come back to this in the Q&A part, because I'm comparing, in fact, I should be comparing assertoric, the genus of assertoric acts in general, including not just what Williamson calls flat-out assertions, just acts intended to provide information, as it were, to pull our information, but also things like guesses or conjectures, or just putting forward what I think we do in philosophy, putting forward propositions with their supporting evidence for our audience to consider them, to think about them. This could be also a very weak assertoric act. So what I should be comparing, in fact, is the norm for fiction in general with the norm, if there is such a thing, for non-fiction in general, which could be of this more general kind. But as I said, we could come back to this later. So I move now to provide my account of what Stacy is doing with this genre account of fiction and non-fiction. She says that fiction and non-fictions are super genres. I mean, if we put genres in, as we should, in a hierarchy of species and genus about the genus and so on, fiction and non-fiction could be relatively high up. For instance, the historical novel could be a sub genre of the the novel. But what does this come to in the ontological terms that I was presenting? I think that what she is defending is as in fact, I take it that what Walton was defending in the paper on categories of art that Stacy relies on, is a historical kind account of fiction and non-fiction. In fact, the ideology that she uses is Wittgensteinian, anti-definitional. But I don't think we should buy this. I mean, properly. If you do things properly, everything can be defined. This is already something that Putnam mentions in the meaning of meaning. He says that the real essence characterization of water is just one of the senses that that the term has, the concept has. He says that is a predominant one, but we don't even need to buy that. But he agrees that the term can be used in a nominal essence sense. And there, the definition that you would provide would be a cluster-like definition, like the definition that Beresford gives for artwork. Yeah, as I say, even water in this nominal essence sense can be defined. I mean, you need some logical constraints to properly do that, but you can do that. The question is, what kind of entity are you defining in that way? In this way, it would be a very superficial, non-explanatory thing. You cannot explain things like the features that we use to pick up water in these terms, because you would be using those very features. So Stacy contends that, in particular, the prescriptions to imagine are just standard features, but non-constitutive properties of fictions. Standard features are features that, so I mentioned some example here. So you take, I think I mentioned already analytic philosophy, but we could now speak about genres like analytic philosophy paper or narrative documentary style. These are genres without doubt. And I think that this Walton's picture in terms of standard, non-standard, or contra-standard and variable features can be used to characterize them. Standard features are those that at a particular point in time are used to pick up instances, paradigm instances of the kind. Contra-standard are those that are taken to pick up things that are not members of the kind, and variable features are features that are indifferent to classification. But the idea is that you use those things to define the entity, and the best definition should be, this is my bet, should be one along the lines that defenders of cladistic accounts provide, evolutionary accounts provide for Tiger, or perhaps Boyd's homeostatic property cluster view. So the idea is that at a particular point in time, tigers have specific phenotypical features. This would be the standard properties, but they may change. They are historically contingent. When the tigers started existing, or when analytic philosophy started existing, there were some features that were standard and phenotypical for an analytic philosopher, like writing about logic or language, focusing on natural language, this kind of thing. But then in the course of time, these things can change. And what matters is that there is some mechanism, some underlying mechanism that explains why these features at a particular time are put together and how they connect with the speciation, initiation in the case of species, the beginning of analytic philosophy in the case of practices or institutions like analytic philosophy. So in the case of the documentary style, features like handheld camera, low film quality, deep focus, they were standard in the 1960s or in the early 1970s, but they were not standard at all in Flaherty times, and they are not standard anymore because now you can use an iPhone to take wonderful footage. So what I think she should be saying is not that these things, fiction and non-fiction, don't have definitions. What I think she should be saying, or this is the way I take what she claims, is that they only have a historical kind account along these features. And the important thing is that for her is that exactly like handheld camera for documentary style, prescribing imaginings would be merely historically contingent for non-fiction. Prescribing belief would be merely historically contingent for non-fiction. And this is what I think is wrong. At least, as I was saying, I like to have an alternative to this because I don't like this historicity for these fundamental cases, like a practice of inviting imaginings or a practice of sharing our information. So this appeal to standard properties distinguishes the proposal for pure relational theories, in which we don't even get any kind of homeostatic property cluster. But there are genuine doubts that this is enough to deflate the usual and, to me, utterly compelling objections to pure versions of this sort of relational accounts. And the most important objection is this one. It's a rhetorical question. How could historically contingent features of a kind explain the value we are temporally put in their instance? So we may like the handheld camera feature of documentaries in the 1960s because it gives an impression of reality, of immediacy. These are values, but of course this cannot explain the value of documentaries because precisely because it's historically contingent. So we have documentaries that don't have this feature, and they are excellent instances of the kind. So I think that this rhetorical question applies equally well to the claim that prescribing imaginings is merely a standard feature of fiction. The same applies obviously and even more clearly to non-fiction. So this is a point that Greg makes in his recent book, or Catherine Stock in her book, Other People. And You can, in this issue of this journal on documentaries, Stacy has a reply to this criticism, or at least she declares that she's going to provide a reply. I haven't been able to find it. Maybe some of you have. This is what I was saying. Yeah, this is what I was saying. Now, Stacy has some considerations, but they only justify that the stylistic manifestations of fiction and non-fiction are genres. But I fully agree with that. And when she tries to provide, when she says that she's providing an argument supporting this, what I take to be this historical view of the fiction-non-fiction divide, in fact, what she argues is that the question whether we can conceive fictions that do not invite us to imagine any made-up content, any invented content. She asked this question, and I already answered that in the positive. I gave what I take to be clear-cut examples of fictions that have this feature. But this is not the question that we need to ask. The question is whether we can conceive of fiction that did not invite us to imagine content. And this, I think, is not possible. Or anyway, I haven't been given any example that shows that. And because of what I said before, I find that to be difficult or problematic. Anyway, I already overextended my time. I had some more comment to make, but I'm sure that it will, things in its vicinity will come out in the discussion. So I will leave it at here for the moment. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Manolo.